I think because for me as a scientist, the time horizon is sometimes very short because at some point in time I have to think about, well, how do I publish something? For landowners, that actually maybe not as much of a concern simply because they own the land and they know they transition the land to their children or whatever. So they have this long-term mindset, which actually is very beneficial for restoring something, a lost ecosystem, simply because they do not have to think just 1 or 2 years down the road. They can think 50 or even 100 years down the road.
All right, welcome to another episode of NCAT's Voices from the Field, produced through our Sustainable Agriculture program, ATTRA. ATTRA has been a trusted, practical connector for sustainable ag producers across the nation since 1986, and NCAT is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and we're excited for 50 more years of assisting both ag and energy users in rural communities. My name is Darron Gaus, and I'm a sustainable ag specialist located in Victoria, Texas, and today I am here with Dirk Philipp. He is at the University of Arkansas. He has multiple degrees from Germany, and he also has a PhD from Texas Tech. And today we are going to talk together about why restoring native prairie matters and what producers should know. So I guess just tell us about yourself, Dirk, where you're located and how you became involved in prairie restoration.
Thank you, Darron, for having me on this podcast. I'm very delighted to talk about that particular topic. I'm located at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. It's in the northwestern corner of the state. And as you mentioned already, I have some degrees from Germany. I have an associate's degree in agriculture plus a degree in tropical agriculture. Then I worked for a couple of years in Nicaragua, and then came here to the United States, working in an environmental consulting company, and then I got a PhD from Texas Tech University in forest agronomy. The way I got involved in prairie restoration has been fairly recently, although I was exposed to the entire topic several years ago or even many years ago. So in West Texas, where I pursued my PhD, that is considered the area a shortgrass prairie, transitioning from mixed into shortgrass prairie. And my supervisor made me aware of that situation. We did a few field trips north to Montana and Nebraska, where I got exposed already to the entire issue of prairies and that they disappeared, and it would be a good thing actually to restore them. So in my work here in Arkansas, I just started relatively recently, 5 to 6 years ago, after a colleague from the horticulture department asked me to take part in a project on how to investigate possibilities for native roadside vegetation on Arkansas roadways. So that's the way I got involved with that, because that meant access to some funds and access to actually buying seed and actually then striking out on my own to do a few more experiments.
Very nice. Very nice. And I forgot to mention that you and I have also worked on the Soil for Water project when it was going, funded by NRCS and SARE. And so we did get to talk about some prairie restoration and barriers, things that we're going to hit on today through that work, especially in the SARE portion where we were specifically talking about grazing. And so even though you were in a different region, we got to work together as a team on that Soil for Water project, and just talking about all things soil and restoring our soil to the sponge that it used to be to increase water infiltration and usage. So glad to get to talk to you again. And I guess before we get into the practical side, let's start, with your own experience of just what first drew you into prairie restoration.
What drew me in was the necessity to restore ecosystems and ecosystem services. So as someone who didn't grow up here in the United States, you go through a transition when you come here to the country, and with a very great respect, and then you assume everything that has been done here had to be done the right way, or there's a certain reason for it doing it. But over time I realized, well, not everything that happened in the past necessarily was a good thing when it comes to preserving ecosystems. And that's actually, I got my passion for that, prairie restoration. So prairies are extremely important for keeping the ecosystem services going, for wildlife, for habitat, and also what you mentioned just a minute ago, namely maintaining soil organic matter, storing water, and filtrating nutrients and all these things, as we see, for example, with the prairie tips in the Midwest. So that drew me basically into work more in the entire area of prairie restoration.
And just in that time, how has prairie restoration changed over that time?
Yeah, I can only talk from my own experience. I know that from reading the literature, so prairie restoration is going on for a fairly long time, obviously, So whenever you pull up maps, you can see there's whatever that number is, 1% just from the original prairie still existing, or 2% or whatever it is. But as soon as it reached a level where people realized, well, that may go away entirely, they started restoring. And that wasn't me, of course. So I find manuals and restoration recommendations from maybe 30, 40 years ago already, especially from the northern states, Minnesota and Iowa and so forth. In my particular case, I went through the process because I could afford it in a way that I worked with that colleague on that project. And then I started a few other experiments and realized the difficulty actually of bringing it back to restoring it or reconstructing it, how some people actually call it, and going through a few iterations. How do you want to establish it? Do you have to drill it? Do you have to seed it manually, or broadcast it? Do you need a drill or not? Do you need to apply certain herbicides to make it actually work? So this is what changed over the course of my career, other than for the most part, when it comes to forest research, I did several things, agroforestry and global establishment and so forth. But now I think that is a topic I really want to focus on entirely.
And just to get some background too here, and maybe a little controversy, is we're from two different states, two different areas. You grow a lot of cool season grasses where I'm in Texas, especially in the coastal prairie. It's a lot of warm season grasses. And you mentioned that you first started prairie restoration with the Department of Transportation and roadside restoration, right? What the producers here are battling now is King Ranch bluestem. And that was actually created in the King Ranch area, in that coastal prairie area. And then it started being used more and more along roadsides to get new roadside construction, to have roots faster so that erosion happened, slower. And now that KR bluestem has spread to a lot of different pastures and prairies. And that in itself is what the prairie restoration and pasture restoration battle is over now. So I'm just curious, like when you were doing your research, how was it, formulated of what y'all chose? Did y'all go straight to native? Did y'all understand that? Or did you try to use improved grasses simply because of economic factors or factors where erosion control was something germinated faster, something grew faster, so therefore erosion control was faster? How did all that pan out while you were doing that project?
Yeah, here in Arkansas, we do not have the problem with that King Ranch bluestem. And in fact, I believe that's one of the older bluestems I did my PhD on, actually. I investigated about it, not that one in particular, right, but about a couple of others, investigating the water use efficiency of these bluestems. So, yeah, those were brought in already a long time ago. I don't know exactly about the what Davor did with that King Ranch bluestem, but those I worked on, they came here in the 30s, right? And they were brought in particular for erosion control. They had a good intent with it. So here in Arkansas, the idea was to simply establish native vegetation that was present, the species that were present in Arkansas before people started using more the cool season grasses. And that was the main motivation. And in fact, the Arkansas DOT already has somewhere manuals or some form of protocols how to get these native plants back onto the roadsides. And sometimes they do. You see roadways nowadays more often where they already have native grasses either established, or when you drive through the Ozark Mountains in the northeastern part of the state, and many times on those roadways you see native vegetation, simply because those areas were somehow inaccessible to a certain degree for livestock grazing, and that's where that kind of vegetation was preserved. So we did not have to battle a certain set of invasive species other than maybe the Johnson grass, right? And that's a big issue. But other than that, there were, let's say, not a lot of barriers when it comes to how do we consider non-native vegetation. And I want to add to that, because that raises an important part. If you try to restore a certain ecosystem like the prairies, you never get that back 100% how it was, simply because once you destroy, so to speak, in my own words, this fabric, it is very, very difficult to put it back together, because then you may get a vegetation and you may get a couple hundred species on an acre or whatever there were on the original prairie, but then how do you get the birds back? How do you get the insects back? And that may or may not happen. So I'm always torn a little bit with this discussion. So if we have a species that wasn't part of that prairie plant makeup, how do we want to deal with it? And in some cases, it's relatively easy to deal with, and in other cases, they're actually very, very difficult. So I remember I heard that argument when I was at a Forge conference 1 or 2 years ago in Texas. Yeah, that is an issue, and I cannot answer that question. You may not get it out, period. So if once it's in, what do you want to do? So other than plowing it up and then try to restore everything, and I don't think that's feasible anyway.
Yeah. And I know we'll get into a lot of those different, actually mechanical ways to restore prairie restoration here in a second. But just to give our audience that may not be familiar with Arkansas or Texas, like here we're, in Prairie, we're talking about big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass. Those are the tall grass species that people think of prairies and the golden waves of grain that we talk about in songs and in history lessons, mixed with other forbs and all these legumes and all this other stuff. But what does a native prairie look like in Arkansas?
Yeah. The native prairie consists of species you just mentioned, the big tall grasses, big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, eastern gamma grass, especially in the wetter areas, switchgrass. Then on the forb side, your typical forbs like black-eyed Susan, which look obviously very pretty, then rattlesnake master and lead plant and indigos and so forth. I have to say that Arkansas is a somewhat special place because it is in this transition from the forest land all the way to the open prairie or tall grass prairie. And we are right in an area here where the savannas were prevalent. So especially oak pine savannas, more oak savannas in the north, reaching into Missouri, and pine savannas more in the south. And the river valley in Arkansas, where the Arkansas River comes through, that was all open prairie land. We had a big prairie in eastern Arkansas. I believe it was called the Grand Prairie, which is now prime rice production land, simply because there's a frangipane somewhere below the surface and almost impermeable layer, which prevented tree growth to take place, and therefore it developed into a grassland, and then farmers figured out, they can pond that area to put water on and then grow rice with it. That's why we grow rice now. And then we had multiple other subforms of prairie, like the clades and barrens, that develop on these outcrops of the limestone, which is the underlying rock. So that's what we have. When you look at a map from all the way coming from north to the south, we sort of have pretty much the same species. Because it's all defined by this continental climate, and the difference is then it is simply colder in the north than it is in the south. But from a species makeup, it is actually not that different. And obviously there are many grasses in South Texas which I'm not familiar with, because as soon as you go close to the coast, you go into that so-called coastal plains, or what the name is, and then you have a lot of wetland species which we wouldn't see here up in Arkansas.
Yeah. When we talk about all this prairie restoration and the different, it sounds like a lot of our prairie restoration and prairie views are the same. And then obviously, West Texas may change a little once we get into that drier climate, and we have more bunch grasses than other grasses. And it's usually based on just maintaining those grasses is based on just a longer recovery time as you get into drier climates. But there's so many there's so many benefits to this native prairie. There's so many ways that it takes care of itself. I want to switch a little bit to in your experience, like why do producers decide to try and restore a native grassland or try and bring back prairie systems that you've worked with so far?
Yeah, there are several motivations. So one motivation is, of course, to bring back something that was lost, maybe more from a romantic viewpoint, and that itself can be challenging somehow to reconcile with reality. And then we have farmers who understand or make the decision on a particular tract of land. They do not want to have a high input agriculture anymore, because whenever you move something from a particular plant community into something different, you constantly have to apply certain inputs to make that stable, right? So if you go from a prairie into a fescue pasture, then you have to do something constantly to keep that a fescue pasture. Now, obviously, when you want to reverse the process, then over the years, you have to do a lot of work to actually bring that back into prairie. But, that's a discussion for a few minutes down the road here. So they understand it makes sense to them. They understand it. The prairies provide summer grazing. And I want to stress the point a little bit now right away that when I talk about prairies, I have to be careful that I do not romanticize it too much, simply because I get excited so much about it. But a original prairie may or may have contained hundreds of species. Now, that is obviously not realistic. So what we've seen in our plantings, we just used maybe 20 forbs and 5 to 6 grasses. We don't even get half of the forbs we planted. So because there's something missing, and I don't know exactly what it is. So when farmers decide, hey, I want to bring the prairie back, then that is most likely a few grasses and a few forbs. But that is obviously good enough to start. And then that implies a different grazing management, obviously, because it's not just a grass, it's a grass forb mix, and that obviously has to be grazed differently. Now, there's another set of landowners, I would say, that fall under the category of rangers and cattlemen, but they are simply people who want to restore land because they have the financial opportunities for that. We just recently met the family in northern Arkansas. They moved from Texas, in fact, to that place. They bought that place. I don't know how many acres, maybe 1,000 acres or whatever. And they came out of the oil business and bought that land. And the landowner lady is restoring that land to her liking, so to speak. And that involves several pastures improved for oak savannas, or bringing these oak savannas back, and then also other pastures where they are completely being left untouched for wildlife habitat, and then maybe a few others for cattle raising. So that is a very, very different approach. And as you can see, that very much depends on the financial ability. So we probably do not see a lot of cattle farmers who have very small acreages and say, hey, I want to bring back the prairie, simply because you have to drastically adjust your stocking rates, your grazing management, and make some decisions that may simply result in less income from the cattle side.
Okay, and now that you discussed it, I'll bring that up now. Again, probably another controversial issue is that even here at NCAT and ATTRA, through the Sustainable Ag program that we run, and we provide technical assistance to farmers and ranchers, we're seeing those different motivations as well. And, across the board, there is, no matter if you are that romantic that, reads these accounts from the 1800s and 1700s and wishes that you could be there and see the bison roaming the fields and just wonder what it would look like, instead of, in my case, now a 0-degree elevation flat land that you should be able to see from far away, but you can only see mesquite trees and acacia trees. Weesach is what I refer them to. That profitability is sometimes what runs the decision-making power to want to do that, to make your land more resilient. That the prairie restoration and restoring native prairie is a resiliency factor, that hoping that once you spend that money up front, there's a return on investment where you can even out your profitability over time in that resiliency factor. And so I'm just wondering, if anyone that you've worked with is also kind of in that mindset, or is it strictly driven from, like you said, if they have the money to do it, they're going to do it because it is a better feed quality, better, feed stuff. What do you see in Arkansas?
Since you brought it up several times already, because I have to perhaps correct myself, I do not work directly with a lot of farmers who try to reestablish prairies. So I worked with a lot of farmers actually, who were part of a program to bring back native grasses, right? So 3-4 native grasses, but obviously that's not a complete prairie. So I worked with a lot of farmers who want to bring back agroforestry. That is part of the regenerative agriculture that works, I worked with a lot of farmers who want to bring back legumes because they understand with legumes you may or may not be able, to offset some end fertilization or some cost associated with that. And also I worked with a lot of farmers who are mindful when it comes to erosion control or repair and zone management. But obviously that does not, as I mentioned that, as you can see, there are very, very few farmers who are interested in, hey, I want to bring that prairie back. So because whenever you talk about that, then you have to talk about fire management. So you cannot bring a prairie back long term without any kind of decent fire management, prescribed burning. Obviously, and that's the entire podcast, right? Where how you would do that essentially. Now, the economic side is look, my feeling simply is when people have the financial means, then they are simply able to think beyond these limitations and the borders they are constricted with. And look, I'm just saying that out of my guts now. If we talk about a livestock farmer who is really relies on the income from cattle, as maybe stock operations, leasing land, and having to feed a family. Look, I do not think, and I absolutely do not hold it against them when they say, no, I cannot afford that, looking into the prairie restoration. Because the number one problem, what I see is the ecosystem services are not being paid somewhere. They're not carried through the supply chain and paid by someone at the back end. So if I go to the store and buy a steak, whatever I pay there is whatever I paid the entire, all the added values that go through the added through the supply chain. And there's not a single dollar in there I pay for a habitat restoration because I like to have insects on a certain area. So I don't think that's and basically I try to answer the question, it is not the case right now because we do not apply a certain dollar value to these ecosystem services. So I think it is very much we rely on farmers or landowners who simply want to do that. So it does not mean it doesn't have to be a former oil executive who comes to Arkansas and wants to build something, because I met several of that type of people, but also maybe someone who farms his grandparents' property. So that's maybe under 200 acres, and he decides, well, I can cut back on the fescue pasture and I try to restore something there. And that wouldn't necessarily cut into his profits because the whatever he makes money-wise from that place does not feed the family, okay? So he has to have a daytime job and that feeds the family. And whether he makes then maybe 10,000 in profit or 5,000 profit from the cattle or 7,500 or 3,500 may not matter to him or her that much. And then they can go and start restoring the prairie. Obviously, that does not mean there wouldn't be a benefit long term, maybe, but that is simply down the road, right? So if you look at the fescue pasture next to a prairie pasture, yeah, in a humid environment, whether you have water to grow something or you don't, and if it doesn't rain, you don't get anything out of the prairie either. So you still have to have some water input in form of rainfall to actually grow something and raise cattle or whatever. So it's not so that you have you all of a sudden can expect wonders in terms of water holding capacity or whatever simply because you have the prairie. That is certainly not the case.
Yeah, and that's this was one of the reasons why I loved working with you on the Soil for Water project, because I could sense that from you. Usually there's sometimes a gap between science and what's going on at the producer level and what they're capable of. And, it's really that practical nature of showing up where the producer is at that time. It's not always just like, well, you could be doing so much better with something else. It's how can you increase your profitability, increase your margins with what you have now by doing, practices that make sense for you, for your operation, for your goals, and get you to where you want to be over time. And that over time is different for everybody. It's different for every region. It's different for every rainfall zone. It's nature, it's environment, and you're not trying to fight against it. Sometimes you have the abilities to help it along, but, are we prepared for if those inputs don't work out, and what's the plan afterwards? And so just talking that through with producers is a big part of the technical assistance that we provide, and just trying to solve the specific problem, but meeting them where they're at. So there's clearly a lot of different motivations depending on the operation, but despite those benefits, adoption still isn't widespread. So I guess just like, what other barriers, we talked about a few, but what other barriers are preventing more prairie restoration to happen across the U.S.?
Yeah, number one is that the benefits are not known, obviously. So there's certainly a lack of knowledge, a lack of information, and a lack of understanding in the end, what that would mean for the land, what it meant for the land, what it means for resiliency of rural areas, what it means for a mental peace. Obviously, if you look at the rural landscape with prairies and then the knowledge, the pure knowledge itself, knowing that there are still wild places existing, that carry animals and birds and insects or whatever that simply vanished from the landscape. And then a major part of courses then beyond that is that people simply have to make a living, and they have to try to make a living, what you just said, with what they have. And if a corn farmer makes a living with growing corn, it is very difficult to then convince that corn farmer, hey, you need to plant a prairie, because how does he make a living now? So, and that was, for example, a discussion always when I was a PhD student out in West Texas. I was lucky to have outstanding scientists on my research committee, and they were at times or philosophically opposed to what my major supervisor, what she postulated sometimes. And one said, well, if you want to convert all the cotton area, irrigated cotton area, into livestock operations, I can show you right now here on the back of a napkin, basically, that they do not make as much money as they do with cotton. Yeah, I fully understand that. So that sometimes it's a philosophy how you approach the use of natural resources, because you need a lot of water from the Occidental aquifer to irrigate the cotton, but that's how they make money. So in the same is then, how would you make the questions, and how would you make money as a farmer for prairie restoration. And I think that word goes into then a discussion. Number one, it's unrealistic to bring the torque raspberry back because it's not going to happen. When we lost 99%, it does not mean we now get back on 90. There is 99%. It's not going to happen. But you can bring back maybe 5%, 10%, and in where you place these prairies, the restored areas, has a lot of impact, has a big impact on how you make these rural landscapes more resilient. So we got the example, for example, these prairie strips, right? They are promoted heavily in the Midwest, and they work because they filter nutrients out, they reduce the nitrate by a substantial amount. They can be placed, as I said, as strips, obviously, along the field, on field edges, within the field. And that is possible. Sometimes it's a little bit of a question if a farmer really wants to do it. So, and if we are able to plant corn across hundreds and thousands of acres, well, we are able to plant a few acres of prairie. That will work. So, but fundamentally, I think, and I'm very, very careful now how to say that, extremely careful. But over the years, and I'm here in the United States now for 27 years, I had to learn the hard way, in my opinion, that just because people live and work on the land does not mean they understand 100% what's going on that land. And I'm fully aware now that it may sound very arrogant, but I had to learn that the hard way. And interestingly, sometimes when you talk with farmers that are heavily involved with the day-to-day operation, livestock, and they have to put the cattle out in the pasture, they have to manage land. But I notice sometimes they observe what's going on there, but sometimes connecting these dots and connecting these pieces is what's somehow missing. And again, it is I may rub some feathers here or whatever, how you say that. But I noticed it several times that I talk to farmers and I say, hey, there's one particular piece of information missing here to connect the dots for you. And that's one of the barriers, in my opinion, as well, right? So simply a lack of knowledge in particular kinds of science or basic things, maybe in even soil chemistry, soil physics, or something like that. And obviously that's a big challenge to change that. And you don't necessarily change that with, okay, let's watch a YouTube video. It's probably a bit more involving with that.
Yeah, and I know you've asked me before to where the type of producers that come to NCAT wondering about prairie restoration, like what brings them in the most, and is it because they're conservation minded or what is it? And I think it's more just profitability. It's getting to a place where they go to conferences in winter, they read magazines, they read all the new forums and all that, and they hear about prairie restoration and how good it can be and how it can make a ranch more resilient. But I agree, they don't necessarily understand everything. And that is a little bit controversial on telling a rancher that you don't know their land and they've been on it for 40 years. And so I think when I talk to folks like that, or looking for technical assistance, I'm just reminding them there's a lot of things out there that we don't understand. No matter how good you think you are, and no matter how many years you've been doing something, there's always something to learn. Humans eat, but do we actually know what happens from the gut to getting iron in our blood?
Right.
That's a huge pathway that we just don't understand unless you're a specialized doctor.
Exactly.
And so do ranchers need to become specialized doctors of ranching? Do they need to understand all those levels? And I don't know necessarily if they need to understand all those levels. I think that they just need to understand. We worked with, on the Soil for Water project, another gentleman named Garrett Coons, and he said something that stuck with me for a long time, and I've been saying it over and over again, is that, we live in a microwave society, but nature lives in a crock pot pace. So, we always want something very quickly. We want to put our ramen noodles in the microwave and get it done, right? But nature does not work that way. It's a very slow process, and you just have to have patience with that and the observation. And that's what I speak to most in some of my presentations, especially around here, is just that observation is not going 20 miles an hour on your four-wheeler through your pasture every day. Observation is not going by your pasture at 60 miles an hour down the highway. It is truly putting your boots on the ground and looking straight down, every once in a while getting a shovel out, understanding what's in the soil, smelling the soil, things like that. It doesn't have to be super scientific observation, but observation is definitely something that a lot of folks need just to understand what nature is capable of, and that prairie restoration is not going to necessarily happen just because you spend $1,000 on seed and go seed it. And so I guess just as a kind of a transition, into actually getting native seeds to be there. Let's assume someone decides they're ready and they've heard all the good news and they want to start changing their KR blue stem pasture into something else. Well, let's avoid KR blue stem right now because
we may not get that out of the pasture.
Yeah, that one's a little bit hard, but something that you want to change, that you want to see some more native grasses. Why can't somebody just plow up their entire pasture and spread native seed and suddenly it's a prairie restoration? Why can't people do that? What goes wrong, and what surprises producers the most about that?
Yeah, what surprised me the most about it is that you have to be very, very patient to bring the prairie back, and at least, or what I then say, or what I call, let's say, a certain plant community, leave alone the prairie and its all its functionality. And second, I totally underestimated the weed pressure, and because from decades and or almost centuries of growing cool season annuals or cool season perennials brought in from Europe, the seed bank in the soil is crazy. So, and that is the biggest challenge. So you have weed pressure, and then you have your at least my personal inability to be patient. So I've seen reports from Iowa and Minnesota where they say, okay, if you have, after 10 years after you seeded prairie plants, or, if you have less than 5% weeds in your prairie, then it's a success. So what you can see already is, first of all, the weed pressure is going to stay with you for some time. And second, if that time horizon is 10 years, you have to, that really challenges your patience. It's why, when we're circling back almost for just a second here, when we said, okay, how do they want to make it profitable? So they did say a long-term effort, and crockpot terminology. Yeah, it is. You have to be in for the long haul. That's what's absolutely needed. There are different strategy, of course. So plowing up may or may not work depending on that form of weed pressure. Then planting strategies depend how the land looked like before. So as an example, that lady we visited a few weeks ago in northern Arkansas, who came from Texas and bought that land up there, which she bought, is basically, to a large extent, has been developed into forest land, but it was oak savanna land before, right? So oak savannas need a certain fire regimen, a frequent burning naturally or set by indigenous people or whatever. And once that fire is absent, you get a development into a dense forest. So in her particular case, when you take the trees out, you're not challenged with a lot of weed pressure. However, in other instances in central Arkansas, or even here up in northwest Arkansas, where we already have quite a bit of formerly open savanna landscapes, where farmers planted a lot of introduced cool season grasses tall fescue and in brome species or whatever it is, then you deal with a weed pressure you really have to take care of. And there are obviously a different strategy. You either suppress it with a herbicide, or you plow it up and then try to kill the weeds. But that may take several years. I mean, some say even now. I mean, I say not to scare them away right away. I said, okay, you need a plan at least on a year of weed control before you even plant native grasses. Now, for the prairie, depending on the site, you may have to extend that to 2 to 3 years, but it all depends what you really want to accomplish. I mean, if you have a mix of just a few grasses and just a few forbs, then I would say, yeah, a year is enough. But then you have to be careful what kind of weeds you have. Do you have Bermuda grass? Then you need that full year. If you have just some other cool season grasses like fescue, you still need a year, but you do not have to be as intensive with herbicides maybe, or with disking or whatever. So a challenge, for example, for the Bermuda grasses, how do you get rid of it reliably and consistently for a long time? I mean, in the long term, and that requires multiple rounds of herbicide applications and probably a couple of rounds of disking to encourage the Bermuda grass to come up, so you can actually kill out everything that's there. So that's basically the main thing I did not expect. Again, that the weed pressure, and also having to be patient about it. So for farmers, I think, because for me as a scientist, the time horizon is sometimes very short, because at some point in time I have to think about, well, how do I publish something? For landowners, that actually maybe not as much of a concern, simply because they own the land and they know they transition the land to their children or whatever. So they have this long-term mindset, which actually is very beneficial for restoring a lost ecosystem, simply because they do not have to think just 1 or 2 years down the road. They can think 50 or even 100 years down the road.
Yeah, it's good that you brought that up, just because we do have to think in different ways. Like, as a scientist, you're running on a grant-funded project that ends in 3 to 5 years, versus a landowner has generations to keep doing that, to ensure that the generations to come have access to it, right? But again, I think a lot of those things it's when the understanding the environment comes into play. And so you may know your land very well. You know where every tree used to be, and this tree used to be here and then got struck by lightning. You know all that. But the producer, on the level of the environment, understanding a fungus to bacteria ratio in there, and just the succession species series alone, like, to where if you do plow something up, that weed pressure is a weed to you, in terms of a weed, meaning it's a plant in a place that you do not want. It is not necessarily a bad plant. It could be beneficial to the diet of any type of ruminant or anything. We need the micronutrients in some forbs in order to build protein synthesis. We're not just talking about the nitrogen and grasses that can convert to protein. They'll need those other 16 essential nutrients as well in those forbs. But in nature's case, that's what nature is there to do. Like, it's going to cover itself. It's going to protect the soil from moving away from itself. So it's going to bring whatever it can, and is on top of the seed bank, up first. And just, I think, germination expectations of when people try to do native plants and native wildflowers, native grasses, whatever, I think just those expectations aren't there, because they're not realizing that you can't go from a high bacteria, low fungal ratio of annuals are what's going to pop up first, to try and get to that native species right away, because a native species is usually more closer to a 1-to-1 fungal to bacteria ratio. And just like you said, when woody encroachment starts happening, then the fungal to bacteria, the fungus is higher than the bacteria, right? And so that's just how succession works in nature. And so understanding that, and then having patience, and then just understanding weather patterns and climate changes and adaptations, mitigations. And then the biggest problem of it all is like how you were describing the management after planting. 100%, no matter, when you talk about that, the romanticism of looking at a Kansas prairie in 1883, there was still disturbances that happened at large scale levels, created that growth, meaning that there was either wildfire fires or fires created from, on purpose by the native people of North America, or grazing. The buffalo, we created our own problem once we started inventing fence lines and boundaries, right? So they could not move from large distances. And in those large distances, if they had to move with the food and they moved far away and then didn't come back for a long time, we're also talking about a rest period that a lot of people don't think about. And so large scale, disturbances in some form, whether it's grazing or fire, and then appropriate rest periods are part of a management plan that needs to be implemented after planting a native species. And in some places, it may take 3 to 5 years to continuous planting once a year to keep this going. And so I'm just, it's one of those things that separates successful and unsuccessful prairie restoration, and doing that is just knowing that there is an environmental reason for natives to germinate. And if that's not present, then that alone can just hinder what you're spending good money on.
I agree.
So if we do those proper management plans, if we can improve success rates, the next question would be whether that demand will grow, in environmental services, just the population that even lives in cities. Do they want to drive through to the next city and see those prairie restorations? There's benefits that a lot of people don't think about just in terms of the 2% of the nation that's farming. They want profitability, but how do we get the other 98% to respect and enjoy and want those things, so that the demand keeps up with it?
Yeah, that's a complex question. And then I was looking at a script here, and then it is difficult to answer because, as you alluded already to it, whenever someone who's living in the city, obviously they have a certain type of work to do, nurses, lawyers, policemen, or whatever. If they drive over to the next town and say, okay, I want to look at the prairie, how exactly does it help the farmer who works on the prairie? I think what's lacking is, and it's easy to say, oh, that's lacking, because I couldn't answer you how to implement that or actually make that happen. So like last year, I was attending a little conference, a regional conference, on smart growth. Okay, so how can we prevent communities eating up pasture land, prime agricultural land, and dump a subdivision on it? And how can we make that more sustainable in a way that we preserve that pasture land and then still provide housing for people? So I don't think there's not a unified agreement among all of us that bringing back something like the prairie is a good thing. And I honestly don't know exactly how to get there, other than starting from square one and then trying to include that into school curriculums or whatever. I don't know. So it would be good if there is if it would be written somewhere, and I don't know if that's possible, write it in the farm bill. Okay, so if we write in the farm bill certain subsidies and on whatever, crop insurance, or I have no idea, but you can write something in the farm bill that says, we provide funding for converting 2.5% of your farmland into prairie. So why shouldn't that be possible somehow? So I think there needs to be a unified political force behind and to make that happen. So, and if certain senators from the Middle East, if they every time a farm bill comes around, they promote corn for ethanol, they can promote prairie, right? In my opinion. So that, the other than that, in terms of demand, I think that would grow simply because not necessarily on the prairie restoration side, because as I said, I want to stress this point again, a prairie is a complex plant community and it is extremely difficult to get that back. And by the way, whenever you look at a prairie, if you look at some of the remnants of original prairies, what you see there is you see clusters of grasses, you see clusters of shrubs. You never see, let's say, those 500 different species in a small space. You see 50 species over here, and then you see 25 species over there, and they cluster, right? So, but if you want to bring back native grasses, then yeah, that demand, I think, will increase simply because farmers realize that provides you summer grazing and it doesn't burn up your cool season grasses. And it actually, it provides a very good type of quality if you graze it at the right time. And the grazing management is different than just moving them out, maybe what they did so far, but it's not so that's too difficult to accomplish. So whenever we are in vicinities of urban areas going out into rural areas, then we definitely have to come up with some strategies how to work together to support farmers to make them do what we actually want them to do. And on the other side, that is obviously it may be a non-starter already, because if I would be a farmer, I wouldn't want to get told what to do and not to do, right? So that has to be reimbursed sufficiently. That has to be paid sufficiently. So if I plant prairie strips or something has to show up on my account somehow, simply because I make an effort, I put it in, I have certain costs. I need to get reimbursed for that. And that is difficult to accomplish right now under the free market, because when people we think we live in a free market, and that's largely true, but that also means we have all the information that's out there accessible at any point in time. And that is absolutely not the case, right? So if I buy a product, I cannot really tell you what the sustainability level on that is or not. So there has to be probably a reworking of a system where I see that when I pick up a product from the supermarket, from the store, is that what's the sustainability level? Does it promote a certain species diversity? Does it promote habitat restoration? When it comes out of those areas, actually that can promote that, So and then that is very, very challenging. So I know that culturally, and I'm aware of that too, because now obviously almost through the entire podcast, obviously I understand, as I said before, I didn't grow up in the United States, and Europeans and Americans, they can have fundamentally different approaches how to solve a problem. So, and what I notice is here in the United States, which I actually do appreciate because it comes closer to my own personality, we have this go-getter mentality. We engineer our ways out of a problem. We use natural resources, and once we use them entirely, we move on to the next, because during that time period we will engineer something. We will come up how we go to the next resource. Europeans are very different. They say, well, if we run out of that particular resource, why are we using it in the first place? And it is always this conflict I have, but somehow we have to find the common ground to say, okay, there are some places that need to be kept restored. They should be restored, and I think that's still possible with some political will. I mean, if we agree upon a joint something that we put into our budgets all the time. Okay, we need to cover Social Security. We need to cover Medicare. We have to have a strong military. That is not questions, but at the same time, we also have then the ability to promote something like a restoration of ecosystems that we lost, which undeniably have certain benefits for the human beings and for the landscape.
Yeah, and so many other things for habitat for other creatures,
Mm-hmm.
and so it seems like, whether it's policy, or if you're a producer trying to make money off of the land, or if you enjoy ducks, there's duck flyways. If you enjoy saltwater fishing, there's
Mm-hmm.
things that happen all the way in North Dakota that can affect Gulf of Mexico watershed, and affect fishing in Louisiana. I mean, there's
Mm-hmm.
there's cascading effects of nature that we all just need to, I think education can really solve. And through all this, the go-getter mentality that we all have, I think collaboration over competition is where, we need to formulate a better plan, and just create more partnerships that we're,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what the end result that we're looking for is, the equation is the same, and we just need to get together and have better partnerships. And so that's hopefully what NCAT does, and that's what we did in Soil for
Mm-hmm.
Water with
Yeah.
you and universities. And the science still needs to be done, because there's also, there could be cascading variables that are negative too. And so sometimes when we do that on a landscape level or a private level, we don't realize what could happen in a negative way afterwards. And so we need the science too, and we just need more partnerships and people to get together to educate farmers and ranchers on why this is important, and how it can increase profitability, and soil health, resiliency, and our future, our food that we all eat and we all need to sustain on, the future of that food. So if you could just change one thing tomorrow that would have the biggest impact, what would it be?
I have a hard time answering that. I was thinking back and forth. I need to tell him something, but just you know, I wished I wished everyone could see or feel that prairie once. Just go through, put your hands out, touch the grasses, touch the forbs. I mean, hear the birds, and feel that place. So a prairie, actually, whenever I'm out there on a prairie, like in Kansas or in Missouri or whatever, a prairie is a very, very harsh place, actually. There's almost no shade. Obviously, there's limited tree growth. You have a big difference between night and day temperatures. This is defined mostly by the continental climate. That means you have really hot summers, you have really cold winters, but this intensity of the experience, be out there and feel it. So I wished, if for a moment in time, if everyone would know that, how that feels, and how exciting that is, then I think that would be a big step forward. I might want to add, you probably heard already about the term baseline shifting. So if we look at a certain system, and we understand that that's the system to be, and then 25 years down the road, the system changed, and this is your new baseline. And whoever comes after us, oh, that's the baseline. Why do you want to change something on it? So that's another big problem. So I wished one moment in time we could really see that all these things maybe all at once we've lost, and somehow make some adjustments. So we obviously cannot bring back the prairie in its entirety, but we can bring back certain segments of it, and manage it for future generations. So I think that's what I dream about.
Yeah, yeah. And that's exactly what brought me into the last few decades of agriculture, is just
Hmm.
moments and times just like that.
Hmm. Hmm.
I was riding horseback, gathering bulls one day
Hmm.
in a oak savanna, and there by myself on horseback, I came across a deer just
Hmm.
grazing on the acorns. And I was like, this is where I want to be. This is
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
I love. This is amazing. There's so many things that I can keep learning just by standing in one place in nature. I could live here my whole life and not know the bounds of what nature can do.
Mm-hmm.
And then other moments, just walking through tall grasses and feeling your hands hit the seed heads like you're Russell Crowe
Right.
in Gladiator, and and
Very
I remember,
romanticizing now.
yeah, but it is. It's what if there's a romantic reason, I think it can push that go-getter attitude towards what you want more of. And so I think that's a great thing. And I think you're doing that through the science at University of Arkansas, and you're hopefully we're doing that here at NCAT with our technical assistants. What's the single biggest takeaway you hope producers remember after listening today?
I hope that they get excited. I hope that they are going to ask questions. I hope they get in touch with organizations like NCAT, obviously, and with extension to perhaps explore some ideas how they can not necessarily bring back the prairie, but start thinking about how do I include more native grasses in my operation. That's a good step. That's a very good first step. Then how can I make my operation more resilient? And also what I hope they enjoy this podcast. It's possible I said a few things they fully disagree with, and that's fine by me. So they certainly are welcome to send me an email and ask me more questions if they want to.
Yeah, that's good. We'll if you're okay with it, we'll put your email address in the show notes as well, and they can reach out to you anytime. And I hope that we have 4 or 5 different topics that you and I wanted to discuss in email, and I hope that happens. And I really enjoy this kind of what I learned in my philosophy class, this kind of open Socrates, the Socrates Cafe type style talking like we just did. To where it's open on both sides, and you just talk to listen and listen to learn. And speaking of listening, all the listeners out there, you can learn more at NCAT.org, our ATTRA Sustainable Ag program. We have hundreds of resources, and then we can put some university resources in the show notes as well, extension resources, NRCS resources. And I want to just thank you, Dirk, for talking with me today. And this has been really fun. And I hope we can keep going on this. So thanks, everyone. And see you next time.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at ncat.org/ATTRA. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. ATTRA Voices from the Field is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It is edited and produced by sustainable agriculture specialists Mara Henn and Nina Prater. It is supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next time. Until then, keep on farming.